Welcome to Sovereign Finance, the show that connects the dots between personal finance, global finance trends, and deep human history. Tune in every week to demystify the money puzzle and protect your interests in a turbulent world. Hey Derek, how's it going?
Very good, thanks, Rob. And you?
Yeah, good, thanks. So last time out we were talking about inflation and about how a 2% rate of inflation is positioned to us as a good thing because that shows that economic growth is being stimulated, the economy is growing, that's a good thing, people are in work, everyone is prosperous. So I think on this episode we're going to pick apart this idea of economic growth. So, it's presented to us as being, necessary. Is that the case?
Well, exactly. This is one of the things which is just endlessly stated without even examining it as a question. Uh, every time they report that economic growth is steady or is expanding, this is presented as self-evidently a good thing. And any time it falters, this is presented as self-evidently a bad thing, which needs attention and some kind of action to correct it.
I think it's worth pointing out that the economy is like a mental construct. It probably means different things to different people. When you talk about economic growth, it's like, is this thing outside of my immediate sphere, I guess, which is something to mention.
That it begs the question of growth of what, and uh, the definition of it or the assumption is that this means growth in gross domestic product (GDP) for the particular country that the conversation is happening in, and therefore by extension in the world as a whole. I'll unpick that in a bit more detail, what gross domestic product actually means and whether or not in itself it's a valid proxy for human well-being in a moment. But what I would like to say first is that, broadly speaking, there's an element of truth in this. I mean, if you look at the British society between 1760 and, let's say, 1970, over that time, there undoubtedly was a substantial increase in economic activity, and some elements of the population, more than others, were indeed much better off. There was a whole class of the population who were very much better off between 1760 and, let's say, 1860 or 1890, and even the poorer elements of society were very much better off between, say, 1870 and 1970. And certainly in Britain and America, and probably over most of Europe, the population as a whole was much better off between 1945 and 1970. And this was correlated with an increase in economic activity broadly understood. Now, having said that, does that mean that this should be going on forever? And is it even possible that it goes on forever? And before we look at that, we need to look at what GDP actually is, gross domestic product. And what this is an attempt to add up or estimate all of the cash transactions that happen in a society. And quite apart from the fact that it's not actually self-evident that adding up coal, steel, motor cars, haircuts, and nylon stockings gives you any kind of meaningful measure of anything. But the concept has various shortcomings which have been examined at length anyway. The first is that it only counts cash transactions. So all of the activity that goes on in an economy, from uh, doing housework, uh, coaching in sports clubs, doing work for charity, it isn't included. So that's quite a big missing. And I think if you look at the way that things have developed over the past few decades, there's been a I would say, a considerable reduction in people voluntarily contributing to others. For example, for 14 years, I was a diving coach. I coached springboard and highboard diving, and I trained a great many champions at various levels, up to and including national level. And I did that entirely as a volunteer. And certainly, when I started, the overwhelming majority of coaches were doing it as volunteers, and they were doing that out of the, if you like, the sheer joy of making a contribution to other people, and seeing those people develop. I mean, my divers not only had the satisfaction of winning competitions, but I believe that uh, it gave them all kinds of skills and attitudes to the rest of life that were entirely beneficial, and carried on into all kinds of other things. Now, whereas nowadays, the overwhelming majority of people who are coaching, certainly in diving, and I would imagine it's much the same in all the other sports, are getting some sort of payment. And there's a sort of implication that they wouldn't do it unless they were getting paid. And I would say that actually detracts from the quality of their experience. It may not make much difference one way or the other to the people who are being coached, although, of course, it does exclude people who are from families that are not prosperous enough to pay the training fees, which are quite hefty.
It still exists in some places though. Like if you're familiar with parkrun, like there's thousands to hundreds of thousands of people all over the world who give up their Saturdays and Sundays to volunteer and to marshal and to set up courses. And I think it's still it's a human impulse.
It certainly does happen, and I would say that, I mean, in a way, this is part of the same point that I'm making, that all of those things are not totted up and added into uh, the calculations for GDP. So that's a deficiency in it as a measure of well-being.
Yeah, and just thinking back to the COVID lockdown period, like there were no park runs, which was insane because it was outdoor activity
Yeah,
in parks. But I think everyone involved in it felt that if that was your Saturday morning routine, then that's got a direct negative implication on your quality of life. But it's not measured, it's not factored into the calculations.
exactly so. So that's one shortcoming. Uh, the second shortcoming is that it really begs the question of uh, assuming assuming that this actually filtered through to everybody equitably, which it doesn't, and we'll look at that in more detail in a moment. But assuming that it did, that becoming that increasing your income has got some kind of linear relationship with uh, your sense of well-being, which if you examine it for a moment, is clearly absurd. There are all kinds of things that bring us satisfaction in life, and not all of them are, and probably not the most important ones, are actually correlated with the level of income that we have.
Perhaps it's worth considering Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because I think what you described a few hundred years ago was people covering the core basis of staying alive and having a roof over your head and having food on the table. But
Yes,
once you got that, you got this kind of diminishing returns from adding more.
yeah, exactly. And of course there are some things that are beneficial, but beyond a certain level, it's actually at best meaningless, and it can actually be spiritually corrosive to be focusing on that.
Spiritually corrosive because you're fixated on the wrong things or spending less time
Yeah,
with family
exactly
or
so. I mean, it can have a destructive effect on your relationships with other people if you're looking at them in an exploitative way rather than looking at how you can contribute to them.
Yeah, what's the saying? It's to love people and use money, not to love money and use
Yeah,
people.
exactly, exactly so. And of course, there are some things which might be desirable. World traveling, exploring, various kind of adventure sports. I like skiing. All of those take money, but beyond a certain point, you get more than you could possibly ever spend. And certainly, I think we've all met people who are in that position.
My wife Lindsay reckons I must have been like a monk in a previous life because I have very low expectations from my daily experiences. Like I like to take the kids to school. I like to pick the kids up from school. I like to go to the woods. I like to walk in the woods. I like to run barefoot on the park in the temperate seasons. All of which don't actually cost me any money, I guess. But that's kind of what I value.
Yeah, exactly so. Um, Having said that, the next point is it's kind of assumed that it's beneficial for society as a whole if you have economic growth. Now, we'll look in a minute at the way the statistics are compiled, and I would say that probably the amount of genuine economic growth that we've had in, for instance, this country over the past 40 years has probably been exaggerated. But even though it's been exaggerated, there certainly has been substantial economic growth. And you have to ask yourself the question, has that benefited the typical member of the population?
I think also as well, like there's a question of what are we measuring here? Like if you open a shoe factory and go and make 1 million shoes and then dump all of the waste products in the river that runs by the factory, that increases GDP because you then create an industry where someone's going to have to clean all that rubbish out of the water. It's going to create a sewage processing thing or a water cleaning thing. So you're creating jobs all over the place. But was any of it necessary? Did anyone want 1 million shoes to begin with?
That was really the leads on to the next point, that not only are we ignoring the side effects of whatever production that we're doing, but we're failing to account for what is consumed in the process. And if you look at the natural world, everything operates in a set of closed cycles. The carbon uh, that is put into uh, sugars and starches by the process of photosynthesis in plants and is then consumed is eventually broken down, breathed out into carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide is then reprocessed by green plants to be turned back into carbohydrates and other organic material. So it's a closed cycle. The water that comes down as rain, it goes through the various systems. Some of it's consumed by living creatures and living organisms. It's then excreted, it runs down, it's processed again, it runs into the sea, it's evaporated from the sea by the sun into the clouds and comes back as rain. All of these things are closed cycles, whereas virtually everything that has been done by human beings over the past 12,000 years has been through an increasingly linear process where we draw in materials, we draw in energy, and perhaps later on in this talk or in another talk, we'll look in more detail about the need for energy in the process of wealth creation. And the consumption of that is not put into the accounting as a cost. And as you pointed out, when we create pollution, which every activity does to some degree or another, uh, the the cost of dealing with that pollution, uh, whether it's actually taken care of or whether it simply accumulates as damage to the environment, is not counted as as a
Or it's not counted for us because it happens in a different part of the world where the people apparently don't matter. I was thinking of of electric vehicles as you were talking. That's probably a case in point.
and it's even worse than that if you look at some of the production, which is a very great deal of what is being produced at the moment is actually destructive. The manufacture of weapons, the manufacture of ammunition and explosives is an entirely negative accumulation, and yet it's the costs of doing that are added in as though they're positive benefit. And then, of course, when they're actually used, they actually destroy wealth as well as causing untold death and mutilation and misery and anguish. So that isn't a positive thing either. And yet,
That's probably one of the biggest contributors to GDP.
it is. It is. Certainly in Britain, certainly in America. Uh, and we're paying for that in one way or another. So, but getting back, as I say, the actual the actual benefit is very unevenly divided to the population as a whole. And if you, even with the rather optimistic view of the amount of that the currency has been debased, as we discussed in the last measure, uh, almost everybody, apart from a tiny, the members of a tiny elite, almost everybody else has actually seen their costs escalate and whatever increases in income they've had fall behind that. So there's been a net reduction in available surplus to most people. And this seems to be totally unremarked. And the the background conversation is the assumption that if only we had a bit more growth, then we would all be better off.
So, is there a relationship between inflation and growth? Because presumably,
Yeah, we'll come back to that as we were discussing in the last situation in the last session. The constant manufacture of money out of thin air by the banks, on which interest is charged, means that something has to be found not only to repay, which is in itself a misnomer, since it was is the repayment of something which didn't exist at all until the loan was created. But not only has that to be repaid, but an additional sum of money has to be paid in interest. For example, the typical mortgage holder might buy a house for, let's say, £200,000. By the time the mortgage has been paid off, and of course this will vary with the length of time of the mortgage and the prevailing rates of interest over that term. But in round figures, in order to buy that house, which £200,000 was paid to the seller of the house, the buyer has had to, well, over the total period of the mortgage, will have had to pay a total of something like £600,000. And so the other 400,000 has all been, in effect, confiscated.
I feel that pain.
Yeah. And uh, we're kind of trapped in this cycle. And it's in order to keep that going that more money has to be churned through the system. The other thing to point out is that we live in a finite world, and economics treats it as though, in fact, the resources are infinite. Whereas it's now becoming obvious that it's harder and harder to get the raw materials. 100 years ago, you could still actually go to streams and rivers and find ingots of pure copper and that were just there for the picking up. Now, in order to keep the supply of copper going, there are enormous open cast mines digging pits hundreds of feet into the ground and pulling out ore, which is over 95% rock, to get 5% of usable copper ores out of it, which have then got to be smelted. And similarly, I think it's obvious that we are actually passing the peak in oil production. There's a debate about whether we're actually approaching the peak or whether we've passed it. But the peak doesn't mean that there's no oil left in the ground, but beyond a certain point, it takes more energy to get the oil out of the ground than we're going to acquire when we consume it. Uh, Again, 80 years ago or so, it was a matter of drilling down maybe 60 feet through some rock, and the oil would literally.
Spurt up,
It
wouldn't it?
was called a
Yeah.
gusher. It was under pressure from the gas above it, and it would literally squirt out of the ground when you hit the oil field. Now they have to be drilled to far greater depths, and they have to be, and it takes a great deal of energy to force it up to the surface. And we've got a kind of hint of this because, as you're probably aware, when you buy a gallon of petrol, actually 10% of it is ethanol, ethyl alcohol, and and that is generated from mostly cornstarch, which is fermented and then distilled. And it's not even clear to me that this is an energy efficient process in itself. It takes a substantial amount of energy to do all that, and it also distorts the food market and increases the starvation amongst the poorest segments of the world. That
Because that corn has to be grown somewhere in a giant monocrop field that perhaps in certain parts of South America meant felling swathes of rainforest or
Yeah, exactly, all these things. So we're certainly running into hard barriers on all these fronts, and although there's widespread denial of the fact, we're getting more, we're getting closer and closer to uh, reaching the end of the road as far as this is concerned. And there were people in the 1970s, uh, literally millions of people who were aware of this, and we felt it was so blindingly obvious that the world leaders must change course because there was no alternative. And we totally underestimated the determination they had not to change course. And we've seen this. We've now had, I think, 28 annual conferences where the leaders have met together and they've either failed to reach agreement or they've reached an agreement.
I don't think those conferences have anything to do with climate, but there we go.
No. And of course, the climate change is only one aspect of what we've just been discussing. So,
People used to like fix stuff though, didn't they? Like people used to fix clothes more often, and like you write about in your book about how the fact that there's no need for your phone to need to be replaced every few years. Like there's no need for your washing machine to need to be replaced every 5 years or 10 years when the drum wears out. Like why not just replace the part that's worn out? But that's not how things are made.
exactly. So that is the most fundamental drawback of using GDP as a measure for well-being. Uh, does it really? Are you really better off buying 10 washing machines over the course of a lifetime than if you bought one and perhaps it had a repair every 5 or 10 years or a bit of routine maintenance? And of course, because of the obsession with keeping the existing machinery running, things are deliberately made so that they're very difficult, uh, if not actually impossible, to repair.
My dad is always complaining about that. He's an engineer and has been tinkering around with cars for years and years and years, and says that it's very hard to do that now, like without specialist equipment or without being a computer programmer.
Yeah, yeah. There was a whole um, industry producing workshop manuals for pretty well every vehicle on the road. That's entirely gone now. And once again, for example, a lot of cars end up getting scrapped because the electronic control system fails at some point or degrades, and the cost of replacing that is often more than the second hand value of the car at that point in its life, which again is a swindle because the actual electronics probably doesn't cost more than £20 or so, and yet the if you try and buy assuming that they're prepared to sell you a replacement at all, it's likely to be 300 or 400. So that is the point that effectively it's a measure of a flow, not a measure of a stock. And what I mean by this, we'll look at it when we look at your control dashboard for your business, the different kind of accounting reports that you need to be aware of at all times. It applies to all manner of things. But if you imagine a bathtub with a stream of water coming into it and a stream of water going out, if what's coming into it is running at a faster rate than what's going out, then the level will increase. And if it's running out at a faster level than it's coming in, the level is going to go down. So that applies, for example, to cash. If you've got money, if your income is greater than the total of all your expenditures, then you're going to be accumulating cash. And what we're looking at with GDP is the rate of churn of goods and services running through the economy, rather than the rate of rather than the level at which they're accumulated. And of course, if you've got your money running out as fast as it's running in, you're actually running to 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 stay in the same place. I mean, I'm sure that was the analogy that Lewis Carroll had in mind in the Alice in Wonderland story, where the Red Queen says, um, "You have to run faster than this if you're going to get anywhere."
But that's most governments, isn't it? As we were saying last time, most governments are in a tremendous amount of debt, so they have to keep it going to maintain that debt.
Yeah, we're certainly moving into a very interesting phase of history, and it's going to be a pretty bumpy ride. But this is part of the reason why we're having these conversations, because the more clearly we understand this, the more clearly we're going to be able to perceive what's going on and take some kind of effective action to improve the situation. So, what would it be like if we had a post-industrial life or a post-growth era? Uh, I don't like the terms that have some of the terms that have been used, steady state economics or degrowth. These kind of apply some kind. The implication is of something that's a bit dead, a bit static, a bit sick. But what I would say is a possibility is to describe it as dynamic equilibrium. Equilibrium means balance, and for instance, if you've got books standing on a table, that's in equilibrium. It's in balance. If you put the book on its edge, it's still in balance, but it's an unstable equilibrium, and it could fall over. A dynamic equilibrium is something that's moving. For instance, if you're walking up an escalator that's going down, you might stay in the same place. And I think that dynamic equilibrium encapsulates the idea of what a functioning global society could be. it would be one that was entirely cyclical, just like everything in nature is cyclic, and which consumes the energy which is streaming in to the planet from the sun every single day. Every single day, uh, enough energy arises from the sun to perform everything that human beings are doing as things stand by this unsustainable consumption of fossil fuels. That was an accumulation of sunlight which was built up over many, many millions of years, hundreds of millions of years in the past, and has just been blasted through over the course of 3 centuries. And also, so dynamic means that it's moving, and equilibrium means it's still in balance. And I think the other reason I like that term is because the word dynamic itself implies dynamism, it implies creativity.
And creativity isn't valued by the current paradigm.
I mean, there's another thing that we'll look at is it's colossally wasteful. If you look how many different designs of washing machines there are, every single one of those, every single different design from a different company has been has taken the energy of a different team of engineers to work over to create that design. Some of them are better than others, and I think in the future will this is again something that we'll cover in more detail, but it will be more on the principle of open source design, such as we have in the open source software movement, which has been enormously successful. Linux, the open source operating system, is what is used on the vast majority of servers on the internet, for example. And that was the collaboration of vast teams of people who were prepared to put their work into one unified project and share the details of how they were doing it.
I think there's a collaboration and community aspect to this as well. So, like on my road, every house has a reusable size garden. Every house is separate. We all have our own lawnmower. If you think about, how often is your lawn is each lawnmower actually being used? Like, do we all need to have our own lawnmowers? Like, how often is the kettle used? There's you could extend it in various ways, and actually by having a shared lawnmower, you'd actually speak to your neighbours more and build up relationships with people, so that when you need something, you've got a network of people around you who could also support you as well, which I think we're going to need at some point.
And even something like traveling on a bus uh, in my childhood. I mean, I don't want to get too nostalgic and starry-eyed about the glorious past, but it was literally the case that in a small town like Winchester, people not just next door and next door but one, but people from the entire street and the next street would meet each other regularly on the bus and chat on the journey, which is, you could say, far healthier socially than everybody sitting in their independent separate cars, quite apart from the wastage of resources and energy that's implied by that.
I think people don't chat as much anyway because everyone's got earphones in and devices on and things like that, which is
They're staring at their phones.
which is a separate thing. But yeah,
So anyway, I think we've more or less covered what is going on there, and seeing that the sooner we all recognise this, the sooner we can create something between us which is more functional and which serves our needs better.
so we're not saying that economic growth is a bad thing, but it should exist in flow. It shouldn't be exponential. It shouldn't be the only measure of success of a community or civilization. It ignores a lot of.
There are plenty of things that we could do which would improve our lives and contribute to the lives of others, which don't need to have a price tag on them, I think, is the bottom line.
Super. Well, thanks to everyone who's listening. If you have listened to the first few episodes and you've got questions, if you've got topics you'd like us to cover, yeah, do reach out. There will be a link at the end of this episode, and yeah, get in touch.
Yeah, and Rob, you mentioned in passing my book. Just in case people don't know, the title of that is "The Letter from 2100," which is a very brief outline sketch of what a workable world would look like, and what we could create between us over the course of the next 2 or 3 generations to replace what we've had now, which is not serving us.
All being well, my children will be 78 and 80 in 2100. So I like to think about what that world might look like.
Exactly.
Great. Thanks, David. Catch you next time.
Okay, thank you, Rob.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sovereign Finance. For more episodes, transcripts, in-depth articles, and the community, please take a minute now to subscribe free at sovereignfinance.substack.com. See you next time.